All right, so today we're going to talk about carbohydrates, how we digest them and metabolize them, and then eventually use carbohydrates for energy. So carbohydrates are our bodies, or the cells in our bodies, um, favorite means of energy, and we have several different ways or several different metabolic pathways that we can sort of unleash the energy from carbohydrates. So in this chapter, we're going to learn about the types of carbohydrates, the properties of these different carbohydrates, where we can get them in our food, and then also how we digest and metabolize them. But first, think about how we get most of our carbohydrates. From what types of sources? Are we getting them from animal sources? No, not most often. Most of the time we're getting our carbohydrates from plant sources. So think about that. How can plants give us energy through carbohydrates? They're able to do that because of photosynthesis. So with photosynthesis, plants can sort of harness that solar energy power, and they store it in the form of carbohydrates, some of the times in starch, and we're going to talk about that. So plants sort of lock in this solar energy, and we have the digestive enzymes within us to be able to break that down to use it as energy in our bodies. So it's pretty cool. Let's see. All right, so in most of your classes, you've talked about the different carbohydrates. You have your monosaccharides, your disaccharides, and your polysaccharides. So this right here should be just a little bit of a review. Don't get too stuck in the mud with these different words that you might not have seen, like your 6-carbon hexoses and your pentoses and your tetroses. Want you to remember your main monosaccharides, of course, glucose, galactose, fructose. And the big thing with these is that they all look fairly the same, right? Chemically, they're the same. You see your chemical formulas right in here. So their chemical formula is the same. What makes them different is this hydroxyl group, right? So you see this hydroxyl here, this one's here, and then you have these two here, all right? Big thing there. All right, we have our polysaccharides. Basically what these are is repeating monosaccharide units, right? They're attached with those covalent bonds, and they make these long chains. So there's lots of different types of polysaccharides. We have our oligosaccharides, which we'll talk about in a second, our starches, glycogen, our glycosaminoglycans, which we'll talk about, and then fiber. So we just have to have different enzymes basically to be able to digest them. And it's also a sequence to sort of digest them from their long chains down into their single units. So these are our main disaccharides that you'd be familiar with, your sucrose, lactose, and maltose. Again, just remember what these disaccharides are made of, and by that I mean which two monosaccharides are making up these disaccharides. All right, and with our oligosaccharides, this may be something you haven't necessarily heard of as much as your standard carbohydrates. But basically your oligosaccharides are a type of polysaccharides. They're listed here different from the others because they're primarily fermented by bacteria in the colon, not necessarily digested and broken down in our digestive tract. But these are what's to blame for flatulence, right? So you think of beans and legumes, a lot of times they make people gassy, right? They need to take Beano or other things like that. That is because of their oligosaccharides. So we don't break those down as much as we do our other carbohydrates, and they then will ferment in our colon. So your oligosaccharides are usually to blame for for your gas. Okay, so plant starches. Of course, we know that these are long chains of glucose or polysaccharides, correct? What we need to know about starches is that once they're broken down, they yield lots of glucoses. And what we know about our metabolic processes so far is that glucose can be broken down and metabolized in a lot of different ways to yield energy. So one thing that you have to realize and kind of wrap your head around in this class is that digestion and metabolism are one and the same, but they're two different processes, right? So we have to digest food that we eat to be able to metabolize it. So think of digestion as this kind of mechanical process that's prepping things to be absorbed, right? So absorption here is your metabolism. We have to be able to digest and absorb these nutrients to be able to put them through these metabolic processes in our cells, all right? So examples of our plant starch are amylose and amylopectin. You've seen this in your other classes. Basically, amylose and amylopectin, you'll remember one has that kind of straight linear chain, and then your amylopectin has that highly branched chain. Basically, what sets these apart is that they have different functions whenever added to food because of that structural difference in them. So one can kind of relate plant starch and animal glycogen together. So think of glycogen to us, right? Glycogen is how we store carbohydrates. We're going to see how different hormones can affect how much glycogen we're storing, because basically we store glycogen whenever we have this surplus of glucose running around in our blood, right? So plants store starch like we store our glycogen. So remember how I said plants, they take that solar energy from photosynthesis and they store it within their structure, within their plant structure as energy, right? So starch is one of those storage forms for them, just like glycogen is our storage form. So if you've ever seen sprouted rice or sprouted grains, any type of sprouted grain, those could have a lower starch content in theory, and that's how they're marketed because of how they're grown or harvested. So these starches, they've, how to explain this the best way? They will make them grow longer than normal and they'll sprout. So having that sprout grow uses the starch in that grain. So it's using that energy to form that sprout. When that sprout forms, it's using that energy, so it's taking away actual starch in that grain. So if we were to go to eat that grain that has been sprouted, it essentially could have less starch. All right, so it's kind of changing the nutrient composition of it. So that's a little lesson for you there. So you may ask, well, why aren't we getting a significant amount of carbohydrates from animal glycogen then? So like if we eat any type of animal protein, why aren't we getting glucose or any type of carbohydrate from that? The answer is because once animals are slaughtered, right, they have this glycogen, but that glycogen is going to be converted into lactic acid. All right, so by the time we're consuming something, it's not going to have those glycogen reserves remaining in those muscle cells. All right, so mentioned earlier are glycosaminoglycans, or your mucopolysaccharides. Examples of these are your hyaluronic acid and chondroitin sulfate. if you remember this, it's going to help you understand what the glycosaminoglycans are. So hyaluronic acid may sound familiar because it's used in a lot of cosmetics, basically because it's really good at hydrating skin. All right. Chondroitin sulfate is a supplement often used for joint pain. So if you kind of think about this, it can help to hydrate the skin, and then it also helps to sort of like hydrate and cushion the joints. And that's because these glycosaminoglycans help with the viscosity of our bodily mucus secretions. So it's able to hold on to a lot of water that then can lubricate and cushion our cells and then our tissues and then our joints, right? Because cells make tissues, tissues make organs, all right? So this is included because it is essentially a polysaccharide, but not really ever thought of that by lay people. Okay, so your book talks about how average carbohydrate consumption is about 500 grams per day. We get carbohydrates, of course, from fruits, vegetables, grains, starches, and then also our dairy products. Milk and dairy are one of those carbohydrate sources that a lot of people tend to not think of. This is especially important when we get to our diabetic educations, when we have to teach people that lactose is in milk and it is a carbohydrate and it can affect your blood sugar. So just something to think about. But so your book talks about the normal carbohydrate consumption, 500 grams per day. Ask yourself, does that seem like a lot to you? In reality, this was pretty normal, even back in, the 1900s. What did happen was there was a little decrease in the amount of carbohydrate consumption, but that's because they stopped eating as much cereal grains. So this declined to less than 400 grams of carbohydrate per day or so. But since then, we have seen a steady increase in the consumption of carbohydrates, but what is unfortunate is that the carbohydrates that we're adding back into our diet tend to be more refined, meaning having less fiber and less of those vitamins. So we're not adding back in those good carbohydrates, or the better carbohydrates, and we're adding more of these carbohydrate dense foods that maybe aren't as dense in nutrients. And what we can see from that is, increases in obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, all of that. So we can't talk about carbohydrates without mentioning our sweeteners, right? High fructose corn syrup is one that we see most often, and that is just because of how efficient and how cheap it is to use in our processed foods. So the USDA estimates that we consume about 153 pounds of added sugars annually per person. Soft drinks alone are provide about a quarter of the amount of added sugars that are consumed. There are a lot of questions as to whether fructose being added to foods is causing the obesity epidemic. Could be the case. I think it's more of a combination of things, Let's see. So we've talked about in other dietetics classes the anatomy of a cereal grain. So you can see majority of the starch found in the endosperm is amylopectin. Of course, the starch is going to be found in the endosperm. The bran is going to hold the majority of the fiber, and then that germ is where most of those vitamins and minerals are going to be stored. When we talk about our refined grains, those are going to be grains that include primarily this endosperm, so the starchy material, rather than the fiber found in the bran and the germ. So whenever we refine our cereal grains, we're taking out this germ and we're taking